We'll turn now to Initiated Measure 29. This is the third consecutive election cycle that South Dakota voters are asked whether recreational marijuana should be legal in the state. This measure allows individuals 21 years of age or older to possess, grow, ingest, and distribute marijuana or marijuana paraphernalia. Individuals may possess up to 2 ounces of marijuana in a form other than marijuana concentrate or other marijuana products. Individuals may possess up to 6 marijuana plants with no more than 12 plants per household. The measure places limits on the possession of other forms of marijuana and marijuana products. Under the measure, the possession, ingestion, and distribution of marijuana and marijuana paraphernalia remains illegal for individuals under the age of 21. Driving under the influence of marijuana remains illegal. The measure restricts where individuals may possess or consume marijuana, such as schools or where tobacco is prohibited. Employers are allowed to restrict an employee's use of marijuana. Property owners may also regulate the use of marijuana on their property. The measure does not affect state laws dealing with hemp. It also does not change laws concerning the state's medical marijuana program. The measure legalizes marijuana-derived substances considered felony-controlled substances under state law. Marijuana remains illegal under federal law. A yes vote adopts the initiated measure. A no vote leaves South Dakota law as is. Speaking in favor of Initiated Measure 29 is Matthew Schweik, Executive Director of South Dakotans for Better Marijuana Laws. And in opposition is Rhonda Milstead, Executive Director of Protecting South Dakota Kids. Patrick Lally of Forum Communications and Sioux Falls Live and DWU student Seth Foote will ask the questions. You may begin.
Matthew, we'll start with you, and then Rhonda, you'll go first with the second question. Marijuana distributed today illegally is a much higher potency than past generations. We also know that marijuana is not the only way to ingest THC these days. There's gummies and creams, vaping, dabbing, which I just learned about not so long ago, can all deliver much higher levels of THC. If this passes, should there be caps on the amount of THC that is present in various products? Matthew, go ahead.
The simple answer is yes. I will point out that Measure 29 does not include provisions that call for regulated sales. That's a policy that the legislature would have to handle after the passage of Measure 29. I consider myself a conservative legalizer in the sense that I support strong rules on packaging, labeling of products, and I absolutely support THC caps on products. I don't think there's any need for ultra-high THC products. And this is the benefit of legalization and regulation. Instead of leaving it to the black market and leaving it to dealers who don't check IDs, who do nothing for product safety or product labeling, product packaging, we can shift sales behind the counters of licensed, regulated, tax-paying businesses, and we can do exactly that, control the strength of THC products, because whether we pass Measure 29 or not, cannabis already exists in South Dakota. The question is, are we going to be pragmatic and take a common sense approach, or are we going to stick with an obsolete, failed policy of prohibition that has done nothing for us for a century?
Rhonda?
I don't think any levels of THC are going to be safe for people. It's been proven over and over again by the American Medical Association, Pediatrics Institutes, and Science Direct that THC is damaging to adults as well as children. So why do we regulate levels? And you know, the other thing is, we talked about the black market. You just mentioned it. Black market in states is much higher sales than any legal market. So we're not going to be able to control the THC. So I invite trouble into our state in the form of a drug that is not safe, that is not responsible, and will never be regulated.
Before we move to our next question, just a quick reminder to our audience to please hold applause and other remarks until the end of each segment. Please go on.
I also want to point out that DWU student Jack Stuchino is actually sitting in for Seth. So
thank you.
He will take the second question, and it'll be for Rhonda.
How will past marijuana-related convictions be handled if the measure passes?
You know, I'll give you my personal feeling. If you broke the law and you were involved with marijuana, you made a choice, and so that is the consequence for that choice. But I'd also like to point out that what the proponents are saying is that people are in prison for ingesting marijuana, and that's not true. If you call any state's attorney in the state, you're going to find out that people aren't in for ingesting. They did something else, and their was reduced down to ingesting just because the courts and the dockets are too full. The other reason people are in prison for ingesting is that they broke parole. They might have been in prison for burglary or domestic abuse, but they violated the probation because they used drugs. That's why they're there.
May I have a rebuttal? I'm just going to point to an article by South Dakota Public Broadcasting that noted that there are 241 inmates in prison for ingestion, costing roughly $30,000 a year each. That's a total of $7.2 million per year. Senator Milstead's correct that some of those convictions were pled down, but the simple fact remains that adults are being deprived of their freedom and locked in prison for a plant that is less harmful than alcohol. You know, I would understand somebody standing here saying alcohol should be illegal and cannabis should be illegal. At least there would be some consistency, some logic there. But to tell people, go drink as much alcohol as you want, even though it is far more addictive and can actually kill you and causes more violence and destructive behavior. But if somebody ingests cannabis, and fun fact, South Dakota is the only state in the entire country in which you can be prosecuted for having cannabis in your bloodstream. That is how severe our cannabis laws are in this state. If you're caught with 1 gram of cannabis in South Dakota, in theory, you could face up to 1 year in prison. These are crazy laws that are completely at odds with what people want in this state and completely at odds with any basic sense of fairness and common sense.
Comment?
Yes.
Over sensational, over dramatic. If you talk to law enforcement, they're not stopping people for having an ounce of marijuana on them. That's not happening. And to compare alcohol to marijuana, there is no comparison. Alcohol is water soluble. People take a drink and within 2 hours they flush it out of their system. Marijuana goes into the fat cells in your brain and it can last there for 5 to 7 days. Marijuana causes psychosis, it causes violent reactions. You don't know what it's going to do to you. Alcohol is different.
I must
10 seconds. We need to move to the next question.
Matthew, I have a follow-up question to that will go to this point, and I think will clarify. We're talking about alcohol. From your perspective, what is the difference between marijuana and alcohol and even nicotine when it comes to addiction and abuse?
Well, the math is pretty clear that nicotine and alcohol are more addictive and kill hundreds of thousands of people every year. I'm not here advocating to adopt prohibition on tobacco. That would be a disaster. We would create a massive black market and fuel the criminal economy. I also am not here to advocate for prohibition of alcohol because, as we saw, that was a total failure and created organized crime in our country. And I'm just extending the same logic to cannabis, which has also had a policy of prohibition that's also failed. I must respond, though, because you are very dismissive of the idea that alcohol is dangerous. Let's use a very simple measurement here. If you put enough cannabis in your body, you cannot die. If you put too much alcohol in your body, you will die of alcohol poisoning. So on this very basic measurement of which substance can end your life, alcohol is more dangerous. And the last thing I'll say is you're dismissive of, you say I'm sensationalist. I've met these people. I've met people who've had their lives ruined, disrupted, derailed by cannabis arrest. I've met people who've lost access to housing, to scholarships. There's people who can't serve in the military. It even can affect your Second Amendment rights. So it's easy, I think, for you to dismiss this, but there's a real world effect and toll of cannabis prohibition. It ruins people's lives for no good reason. It's a total overreach of government power and authority.
Rhonda.
Cannabis and addiction. Across this nation, drug treatment centers and counselors have proven over and over that marijuana leads to other drug addictions. That's what kills people. They're addicted to meth, they're addicted to opioids, they want something more. That's where marijuana leads. You talk to law enforcement in the state and they'll tell you that people who are on meth or on opioids or getting caught with fentanyl, it's because they started with marijuana. I'm not saying every marijuana user goes to those levels, but they don't use less, they use more. That's what's dangerous.
But the question is there a difference between marijuana and alcohol addiction? At its core, do you believe there's a difference between those two?
There is a difference. People drink alcohol. I mean, how many people are social drinkers? They have a drink with dinner. They're not addicted to alcohol, but there are people that become addicted that drink too much. But there's a difference. Marijuana is an addictive drug from the very first one. That's the difference.
Matthew, do you have any
I'm
rebuttal?
trying to find the exact numbers so I can read them to you, but it's pretty clear based on the science that nicotine and alcohol are more likely to become addicted to them. But let's talk about the gateway theory, this idea that you try cannabis and all of a sudden you want to do hard drugs. It's been refuted, it's been debunked. The real gateway is prohibition. Your policy is the gateway, because the reason I say that is right now, if you're going to go buy cannabis in South Dakota and you don't have a medical card, you're going to a dealer. And guess what? The dealers don't check IDs, they don't have any safety, and they might be selling other substances. Whereas if you're in Alaska or Montana and you go buy cannabis, you're going to a licensed regulated business. It is prohibition of cannabis that exposes people unnecessarily to harder drugs in our society. If we could shift cannabis out of the illicit market and put it into regulated businesses, we will reduce exposure to harder drugs that dealers are often offering people who just want to buy cannabis. So if you're concerned about the gateway, prohibition is the gateway, and Measure 29 legalization is reducing exposure to hard drugs in our society.
We have time for one more question before our closing statements.
What are the projected tax revenues from legalized marijuana? The LRC fiscal note says that it's minimal because the distribution of marijuana would still be illegal. Should any tax money that does come in simply flow into the state's general fund, or should it be specifically used for substance abuse and recovery programs across the board?
Rhonda, that's for you.
I think he should answer first because I don't think there's revenue.
You're correct. There is no revenue. This initiative only legalizes possession. We would have liked to have written a comprehensive initiative, but due to the ruling in the Amendment A case, which you'll recall is when a court overturned the will of 54% of South Dakota voters after the 2020 election, due to the precedent established by the Amendment A ruling, it restricted us in terms of how broad a policy we could craft in Measure 29. So this is bulletproof, it's airtight, and it's just about possession. Now, our expectation is if we pass Measure 29, the legislature will hopefully pass an implementation bill that would set a tax rate. In terms of how that revenue is allocated, I would be comfortable with it going to the general fund. I would also be comfortable with it being dedicated to substance abuse treatment. I would respect the legislature's decision on how to allocate those funds.
There is minimal revenue possible from paraphernalia and some different associated products with marijuana that's mentioned in the LRC note. Any specific use for that, Rhonda?
Well, I guess I'd like to comment on the overall revenue. I mean, they're saying that there will be $100 million in revenue, and talking whenever they go and they fight for recreational marijuana to be legalized in the state, they're saying there's going to be this great revenue stream for the state. Well, I mean, in Colorado, it's $1 in, $4.50 out. The states that have legalized it aren't finding this revenue. If they would, they'd be paving their streets with gold. And what are they? Lining up tents on their streets. That's what happens with marijuana. There's not revenue. And to say $100 million in revenue is going to come into our state, we're saying that if we pass IM 28, we're going to lose $100 million in food tax, and then we're going to replace that with $100 million in marijuana. That's a lot of marijuana sales, and I don't think that's reality.
I just want to clarify one thing, Matthew, and it should be, I think, a quick answer. Under this, there is no provision to allow distribution. There won't be dispensaries on the corner unless the legislature takes further action, correct?
Correct.
30 seconds for these responses, please.
Correct. I also just want to rebut the study you cited, the $4.50 spent for every tax dollar brought in, totally has been disproven. It's from the Centennial Institute, the Colorado Christian University. They had really wacky ways of coming up with their numbers. The proof is in the pudding. $15 billion of tax revenue have been generated by states. That includes $132 million in just a couple years over in Montana. The revenue is real, and the idea
10
that it is
seconds.
being... Got it.
Revenue's not real. I mean, what they're spending in extra law enforcement and medical costs, an emergency room, mental health illness, there's revenue, but there's 4 times the cost that by legalizing marijuana.
Mr. Schweik, you have 1 minute for your closing statement, please.
Well, I want to start with a very simple message. This is about freedom. and it's about what power you think the government should have over your life. Do you think the government should be able to lock you up for possession of a plant that is less harmful than alcohol? Does that seem like it's respecting individual liberty or personal responsibility? I do not think so. I think that when you give the government power to lock you up, to take away your freedom, you better have a very good reason for giving the government that power. And cannabis prohibition is not a good enough reason. I want to finish with this. I'm sure my opponent will finish with a number of claims about how terrible legalization is across the country. I hear it endlessly from the opposition campaign. They're pretty loose with the facts, but I'll finish with this. 24 other states have legalized cannabis for adults 21 and over. In those 24 states, and that's happened since 2012, not a single one of those states has repealed the policy. In none of those states has a repeal bill passed even a state house or a state senate, let alone a state legislature. In none of those 24 states has there been a ballot initiative to repeal legalization. If even 10% of what my opponent says is true, wouldn't we have seen one state take one step towards repealing this policy? Instead, we've seen no desire to repeal it because the policy works, because it's common sense, and it respects personal freedom. Thank you.
Rhonda Milstead, 1 minute closing.
Why should you vote no on Initiative Measure 29? When choosing on any ballot issue how to vote, the questions that you should ask and be answered are, what are the benefits and the risks for me personally and for South Dakota as a whole if this proposal passes? Legalizing marijuana has serious potential harm, risk for individuals, for communities, and the state of South Dakota with no identifiable benefits. As proven by state after state after state, this drug brings more poverty, more crime, more mental health issues, more youth at risk, more violence, more addiction. It's selfish, it's unsafe, and it's unhealthy for users and non-users. You need to do the research for yourself and think about kids. At the very base, is it worth harming our children and destroying their future by a drug that will make them ill, if not kill them? So think about it before you vote. Thank you.
That's our time for Initiated Measure 29. Thank you to our participants and to our journalist and student for the questions.